The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Claire drove into the driveway of her Aunt Margaret's house for the last time. The windshield wipers scraped a steady rhythm against the glass, and the sky pressed low and gray over the old Victorian that sat at the end of Maple Street, like a relic from another century. She cut the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the peeling paint and sagging porch, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settle into her bones. It wasn't just the drive that had drained her, it was everything. The eviction notice taped to her apartment door 2 weeks ago, the calls from debt collectors that she'd stopped answering, her daughter Emma's worried face when Claire had explained they might need to move again. At 34, Claire felt like she'd been running uphill her entire life, while the slope only got steeper. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister Jennifer. Already inside, hurry up. No greeting, no warmth, just the usual impatience that had defined their relationship since childhood. Claire grabbed her jacket and stepped out into the drizzle. The house loomed before her, dark windows reflecting nothing, the garden overgrown with weeds that tangled around the iron fence. Aunt Margaret had lived here alone for 43 years, ever since her husband died in a factory accident back in 1981. She'd been the family eccentric, the one who collected quilts and refused to throw anything away, who spoke in riddles and smiled at jokes no one else understood. When she passed last month at 87, no one had seemed particularly sad, only obligated. Inside, the air smelled of mothballs and old wood. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with photographs in tarnished frames. Claire recognized some of the faces. Her grandmother as a young woman, her father before the drinking started, Margaret herself, standing beside a man with kind eyes and a worn smile. The living room was crowded. Her brother Michael stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his expensive watch catching the dim light from the overhead bulb. Jennifer sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her designer handbag resting on the cushion beside her. Their cousin Paul leaned against the doorway, chewing gum, looking bored. And at the center of it all sat Walter Grimsby, the estate lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather briefcase that looked older than Claire. Finally, Jennifer muttered without looking up. All right, we've been waiting. Claire ignored her and took a seat in the corner, folding her hands in her lap. The room felt smaller than she remembered, cluttered with furniture that hadn't been moved in decades. Stacks of quilts sat folded on every available surface, their colors faded, their edges frayed. Margaret had made most of them herself, spending long nights at her sewing machine, humming old hymns while her needle moved in steady rhythm. Claire had loved those quilts as a child. They'd been the only warmth she'd known during the summers she'd spent here, escaping the chaos of her parents' crumbling marriage. Walter cleared his throat and opened the briefcase. Thank you all for coming. As you know, Margaret Whitmore left specific instructions regarding the distribution of her estate. He pulled out a thin stack of papers and adjusted his glasses. The house itself will be sold, and the proceeds divided equally among the four of you. However, Margaret also left personal items to be distributed according to her wishes. Michael straightened. What about the savings? She must have had something put away. Walter's expression didn't change. There is no savings account. Margaret lived on a modest pension and social security. The house is the primary asset, though it will need significant repairs before it can be listed. Jennifer laughed, sharp and bitter. Of course, typical Aunt Margaret. All those years living like a hermit, and she leaves us a dump. There are also personal belongings, Walter continued, his tone patient. War furniture, household items, and her collection of quilts. Margaret left instructions that each of you may choose one item of personal significance before the estate sale. Quilts? Paul snorted. What are we supposed to do with old blankets? Walter didn't answer. He simply read from the document in his hand. To Michael, I leave my grandfather's pocket watch. To Jennifer, my mother's pearl necklace. To Paul, the oak writing desk in the study. He paused, then looked directly at Claire. And to Claire, I leave the quilt chest in the attic. She always admired it as a child. The room went silent. Claire blinked, surprised. She remembered the chest vaguely, a large wooden trunk that Margaret had kept tucked away in the corner of the attic, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. She'd asked about it once when she was 10, and Margaret had smiled and said it held memories too heavy to carry downstairs. A chest? Jennifer's voice dripped with disbelief. She gets a whole piece of furniture, and the rest of us get trinkets? Walter's expression remained neutral. The chest was specifically designated for Claire. It contains quilts and personal items that Margaret wished her to have. Michael shook his head, already losing interest. Fine. Who cares? Let's just get this over with. When can we list the house? Within the next 30 days, Walter said. I'll handle the paperwork. You're free to collect your items today. The meeting dissolved quickly after that. Michael pocketed the watch without examining it and left first, muttering about a conference call. Jennifer took the necklace, held it up to the light, and frowned. Probably fake, she said, dropping it into her purse. Paul wandered into the study to claim the desk, already texting someone to help him move it. Claire remained seated, staring at the floor, feeling the familiar sting of being dismissed. It was always this way. The scraps, the leftovers, the things no one else wanted. Walter approached her quietly. The chest is upstairs. Margaret left a note for you. He handed her a small envelope, yellowed with age, her name written in Margaret's shaky handwriting across the front. She was quite specific that you receive it. Claire took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Thank you. He nodded and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Alone in the living room, Claire opened the envelope. The note inside was brief, written in the same unsteady script. Dearest Claire, so this chest has been in our family for generations. It holds more than fabric. It holds the stories we couldn't speak aloud. I trust you will understand. With love, Aunt Margaret. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. The words felt heavy, weighted with meaning she couldn't yet grasp. Upstairs, the attic waited. She climbed the narrow staircase slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight. The attic was dim, lit only by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust particles floated in the air like snow, and the smell of old fabric filled her lungs. Boxes were stacked along the walls, their contents forgotten. And there, in the far corner beneath a small window, sat the chest. It was larger than she remembered, almost 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, and made of dark wood that had aged to a deep mahogany. The surface was scarred with scratches and dents, evidence of decades of use. The lid was heavy, secured with a simple iron latch that had rusted slightly around the edges. Claire knelt beside it, running her fingers over the wood, feeling the grain beneath her palm. It was solid, well made, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. She unlatched the lid and lifted it slowly. Inside, folded neatly, were quilts. Layers and layers of them, their colors muted by time. She recognized some of the patterns. The log cabin quilt Margaret had made the summer Claire turned 12. The double wedding ring quilt that had hung in the guest bedroom. Each one carried a memory, a fragment of a life lived quietly and without complaint. Claire lifted the top quilt carefully, unfolding it across her lap. The stitching was precise, the fabric soft despite its age. Beneath it lay another, and another, each one folded with the same meticulous care. She didn't know how long she sat there, going through the quilts one by one, her fingers tracing the seams, her mind drifting back to those long-ago summers. Margaret had taught her how to sew during one of those visits, guiding her small hands as she pushed the needle through fabric, teaching her patience and precision. "Every stitch tells a story," Margaret had said. "You just have to know how to read it." By the time Claire reached the bottom of the chest, the light outside had dimmed to dusk. She lifted the last quilt, a patchwork of blues and greens, and noticed something beneath it. The interior lining of the chest, a faded cotton fabric, was slightly loose along one edge. She pulled at it gently, and it came away easily, revealing a narrow gap between the fabric and the wood. Her heart quickened. She peered into the gap, squinting in the low light, and saw something glint faintly in the shadows. Reaching in carefully, her fingers closed around a small object. She pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was a brooch, old and tarnished, its center set with a stone that caught the dim bulb's glow and fractured it into tiny rainbows. The metal was heavy in her palm, the craftsmanship intricate. She turned it over, examining the back, and noticed faint markings etched into the silver. It looked expensive. Far more expensive than anything Margaret should have owned. Claire's pulse quickened. She set the brooch aside and tugged at the lining again, pulling it back farther. More objects tumbled out. A necklace with a deep red stone, a pair of earrings set with clear, brilliant gems, a small ring with a stone so dark it looked black in the shadows. She stared at them, her breath catching in her throat. They were beautiful, delicate, and completely out of place in an attic filled with dust and forgotten quilts. She reached deeper, her fingers brushing against more objects. They were sewn into the lining, hidden in pockets that ran along the entire interior of the chest. One by one, she pulled them out, laying them on the floor beside her. Brooches, necklaces, rings, bracelets. Some were simple, others ornate. All of them glittered faintly in the weak light, their stones catching and refracting the glow in ways that made her eyes ache. By the time she finished, there were dozens of pieces scattered around her, a small fortune in jewelry that no one had known existed. Claire sat back, her hands shaking, her mind racing. Where had these come from? Margaret had lived simply, her wardrobe plain, her lifestyle frugal. There had never been any indication of wealth, hidden or otherwise. Yet here it was, tucked away in a chest that had sat forgotten in the attic for decades. She picked up one of the necklaces, holding it up to the light. The stones were flawless, their facets sharp and clean. She didn't know much about jewelry, but even she could tell these weren't costume pieces. They were real. Her first instinct was to call her siblings, to show them what she'd found. But she stopped herself, her hand hovering over her phone. Jennifer's voice echoed in her mind. "Oh, she gets a whole piece of furniture, and the rest of us get trinkets?" Michael's dismissive laugh. Paul's disinterest. They hadn't wanted the chest. They'd mocked it. Mocked her for taking it. If she told them now, they'd demand their share. They'd argue that the jewelry should be part of the estate, divided equally. They'd take it from her without a second thought, just as they'd taken everything else her entire life. She put the phone down. Instead, she carefully gathered the jewelry, placing each piece back into its hidden pocket within the lining. She folded the quilts over them, restoring the chest to the way it had looked when she'd first opened it. Then she closed the lid and latched it, her heart still pounding. She needed time to think, to understand what this meant, to figure out what to do next. And by the time she made her way downstairs, the house was empty. Jennifer and Michael had already left, their cars gone from the driveway. Paul's truck was parked by the curb, and she could hear him grunting as he loaded the desk into the back. She slipped past him without speaking and went back to her car, her mind spinning. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with moisture, clinging to her skin like a second layer. She sat in the driver's seat, staring at the house, the chest still upstairs waiting for her. She called Emma. The phone rang 3 times before her daughter's voice came through, bright and hopeful. "Mom, how did it go?" Claire forced a smile even though Emma couldn't see it. "It went fine, honey. I'll be home soon." "Did you get anything?" "Just an old chest. Nothing exciting." Emma's disappointment was audible. Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad you're coming home. I miss you." "I miss you too, sweetheart. I'll see you in a few hours." She hung up and sat in the silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. The eviction notice, the debt collectors, Emma's worried face. For years, she'd been drowning, barely keeping her head above water. And now, suddenly, there was a lifeline. But she didn't know how to reach for it. She didn't know if it was real, or if it would be taken from her the moment she tried. The drive home was long and dark, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Michael's car following her, or Jennifer's, their faces twisted with suspicion. But the road behind her remained empty. By the time she pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, the exhaustion had settled so deeply into her bones that she could barely move. She sat for a moment, her hand still gripping the steering wheel, and tried to steady her breathing. Inside, Emma was asleep on the couch, her small body curled beneath a blanket, her homework spread across the coffee table. Claire knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face, and felt the familiar ache of guilt. Emma deserved better. Better than this cramped apartment with its peeling wallpaper and broken heater. Better than a mother who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet. Better than the constant fear of where they'd live next. She covered Emma with the blanket and went to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water she didn't drink. The jewelry was still in the chest, still hidden, still waiting. She didn't know what it was worth. She didn't know how to find out. But she knew one thing with certainty. Whatever it was hers. Margaret had left it to her, not to Michael, not to Jennifer, not to Paul, to her. And she wasn't going to let them take it. The next morning, Claire woke early, her body aching from the tension that had kept her awake most of the night. She made breakfast for Emma, watched her daughter eat cereal while chattering about school, and forced herself to smile and nod in all the right places. When Emma left for the bus, the apartment fell silent again, and Claire was alone with her thoughts. She sat at the kitchen table, the note from Margaret spread out in front of her, and read it again. It holds more than fabric. It holds the stories we could not speak aloud. What stories? Margaret had never spoken of wealth or secrets. She'd been a seamstress, a woman who lived simply and died quietly. There had been no scandals, no whispers of hidden fortunes. Yet the jewelry existed. It was real. And Margaret had gone to great lengths to hide it, sewing each piece into the lining of the chest, trusting that someday someone would find it. Trusting that Claire would find it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. "Did you take the chest yet? We need to schedule the estate sale." Claire's jaw tightened. She typed back quickly. "Yes, I picked it up yesterday." "Good. Let me know if there's anything valuable in there. We should get it appraised." Claire stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then she typed, "It's just quilts. Nothing worth anything." The response came almost immediately. Figures. Aunt Margaret always had terrible taste. She set the phone down, her hands trembling. She needed to move quickly. If she was going to do this, she needed to act before anyone started asking more questions. She called in sick to work, ignoring the irritation in her manager's voice, and drove back to Aunt Margaret's house. The neighborhood was quiet in the morning light, the street empty except for a few parked cars. She let herself in with the key Walter had given her and climbed the stairs to the attic. The chest sat exactly where she'd left it. She opened it again, pulling out the quilts and stacking them beside her, then carefully removing the lining to reveal the jewelry. In the daylight streaming through the small window, the pieces looked even more stunning. The stones caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes of color. Reds, blues, greens, clear whites that sparkled like captured stars. She counted them. 43 pieces in total, each one unique, each one beautiful. She took photographs with her phone, careful to capture every detail. Then she wrapped each piece in tissue paper and placed them in a small cloth bag she'd brought from home. The quilts went back into the chest, the lining carefully restored. She closed the lid and latched it, then carried the chest downstairs to her car. It was heavy, awkward to maneuver, but she managed to get it into the back seat without scratching the wood. Paul's truck was gone. No one saw her leave. Back at the apartment, she hid the bag of jewelry in the back of her closet beneath a pile of old sweaters. The chest she left in the living room, its presence unremarkable, just another piece of furniture in a space already too crowded. Emma came home from school, glanced at it and shrugged. "What's that?" "A chest from Aunt Margaret. It has some old quilts in it." Emma wrinkled her nose. "Smells like mothballs." "It does," Claire agreed, "but it's ours now." That night, after Emma was asleep, Claire sat at her laptop and began researching. She searched for antique jewelry appraisers, read reviews, compared prices. Most of them required appointments weeks in advance, their services expensive, their expertise questionable. She needed someone discreet, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who could tell her the truth without alerting anyone else. It took 3 days of searching before she found a name. Gabriel Roth. He ran a small shop in the city, an hour's drive from her apartment, specializing in estate jewelry and appraisals. His website was simple, professional, and included a note at the bottom: "Confidential consultations available." That was what she needed. Confidentiality. She called the number listed and left a message. He called back the next morning. His voice was measured, calm, with a faint accent she couldn't place. "This is Gabriel Roth. You left a message about an appraisal?" "Yes," Claire said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have some jewelry, family pieces. I'd like to know what they're worth." "Of course. Can you bring them to the shop? I'm available tomorrow afternoon." She hesitated. "I'd prefer something more private. Is that possible?" There was a pause. Then, "I can arrange a consultation at my office after hours. To 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. Does that work?" "Yes, thank you." "Bring the pieces with you, and any documentation you have regarding their origin." Documentation. She had none. Only Margaret's note and the chest itself. But she agreed, and hung up, her heart pounding. Tomorrow evening, she'd have answers. Tomorrow evening, she'd know whether the lifeline was real or just another illusion. The next day passed in a haze. She went through the motions at work, her mind elsewhere, counting down the hours. Emma stayed with a neighbor after school, the same elderly woman who sometimes watched her when Claire worked late. By 5 o'clock, Claire was on the road, the cloth bag tucked carefully into her purse. The drive felt longer than it should have, every red light stretching endlessly, every mile marker dragging her deeper into uncertainty. The Gabriel Roth shop was tucked into a narrow street, lined with old brick buildings, the kind that had once housed factories and now held boutiques and cafes. The sign above the door was simple, gold letters on black: Roth and Company Fine Jewelry. She parked across the street and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. Then she stepped out into the cool evening air and walked to the door. Inside, the shop was small but elegant. Glass cases lined the walls, filled with rings and necklaces that glittered under soft lighting. The floor was polished wood, the air faintly scented with something floral. A man stood behind the counter, tall and thin, with gray hair and sharp eyes that studied her as she entered. He wore a dark suit, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Harper?" he asked. "Yes." "Gabriel Roth." He extended his hand, and she shook it. His grip was firm, professional. "Please, come to the back." He led her through a door behind the counter into a small office. A desk sat against one wall, covered with tools and magnifying glasses. A lamp cast bright light across the surface. He gestured to a chair, and she sat, placing her purse on her lap. He took the seat opposite her, folding his hands on the desk. "You mentioned family pieces," he said. "May I see them?" Claire reached into her purse and pulled out the cloth bag. She set it on the desk, then unwrapped the first piece. The brooch, the one she'd found first, its stone glinting in the light. Gabriel picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hands, his expression shifting from neutral to focused. He reached for a magnifying glass and examined the stone, the setting, the markings on the back. Minutes passed in silence. Claire barely breathed. Finally, he set the brooch down and looked at her. "Where did you get this?" "It was my aunt's. She passed away recently. She left me a chest of quilts, and I found these sewn into the lining." He nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the brooch. "This is a natural ruby. Burmese, if I'm not mistaken. The setting is platinum. Late 19th century, possibly earlier. It's exceptional quality." Claire's throat tightened. "How much is it worth?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the cloth bag. "May I see the others?" She nodded, and he began unwrapping each piece, laying them out across the desk in a careful arrangement. The necklaces, the rings, the bracelets, the earrings. Each one received the same meticulous examination, the same measured silence. As the collection grew, Claire watched his expression shift from focused to something closer to astonishment. He said nothing, but his hands moved more slowly, more deliberately, as if afraid to damage what he was holding. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. The silence stretched long and thin, broken only by the faint hum of the lamp. Claire felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Finally, Gabriel looked at her, and his expression was grave. "Ms. Harper," he said quietly, "do you understand what you have here?" She shook her head, unable to speak. He gestured to the jewelry spread across the desk. "These are not ordinary pieces. Each one is museum quality. The rubies, the sapphires, the emeralds are all natural, all exceptional grade. The diamonds are old mine cuts, which dates them to the 19th century or earlier. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. These were made for royalty, or, at the very least, the wealthiest aristocracy." Claire's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "What are they worth?" Gabriel hesitated, then reached for a notepad and began writing. Numbers filled the page, one after another, each one larger than the last. When he finished, he slid the notepad across the desk. Claire stared at the final figure at the bottom. Her vision blurred. The number was so large it didn't feel real. $234 million. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room tilted slightly, and she gripped the desk to steady herself. "That can't be right," she whispered. "I assure you." It is," Gabriel said, his voice calm but firm. "I would need to conduct a more thorough appraisal, of course, bring in specialists to verify the provenance. But based on what I see here, this collection is worth at least that amount, possibly more." Claire's mind raced. 234 million. The number was incomprehensible. It was more than she could ever spend, more than she could ever need, more than she'd ever dreamed of having. And it was hers. Margaret had left it to her. hidden in the lining of a chest that no one else had wanted. How? She managed to ask. How did my aunt have these? Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. That's a question I can't answer. But I can tell you this. A collection like this doesn't come from nowhere. These pieces were acquired over time, not likely through inheritance or purchase from estates. Your aunt either inherited them herself or was entrusted with them by someone who did. They've been hidden for a reason. What reason? That, he said, is something you'll need to discover on your own. Claire gathered the jewelry slowly, wrapping each piece in tissue paper with trembling hands. Gabriel watched her in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she placed the cloth bag back into her purse and stood. Her legs felt unsteady, as if the floor beneath her had shifted. What should I do? She asked. Be careful, Gabriel said simply. A collection like this will attract attention. If you decide to sell, you'll need legal representation, security, and discretion. People have been killed for far less. The word killed hung in the air between them. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She nodded, thanked him quietly, and left the shop. Outside, the street was dark, the air cold against her flushed face. She walked to her car in a daze, the weight of the jewelry in her purse suddenly unbearable. $234 million, hidden in a chest, left to her by an aunt who'd lived in poverty. None of it made sense, but it was real as the eviction notice, as real as Emma's worried face, as real as the life she'd been struggling to hold together. She drove home slowly, her mind spinning. By the time she pulled into the parking lot, one thought had crystallized above all others. She couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Not until she understood what this meant. Not until she was ready for what came next. Because Gabriel had been right. A fortune like this changed everything. And change, she was learning, could be as dangerous as it was liberating. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Gabriel's words echoing in her mind. $234 million. The number felt abstract, impossible, like something from a movie or a dream. Yet the jewelry was real, hidden in her closet, wrapped in tissue paper, waiting. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the stones glittering under Gabriel's lamp, saw his careful hands turning each piece over, saw the expression on his face shift from professional interest to genuine astonishment. She thought about Margaret, about the woman who'd lived in that crumbling Victorian house with peeling paint and overgrown weeds, who'd worn the same 3 dresses in rotation, who'd eaten canned soup and day-old bread. How had she come to possess a fortune like this? And why had she hidden it away, sewing it into the lining of a chest, trusting no one with the secret until she died? The questions circled endlessly, offering no answers. By the time morning light crept through the curtains, Claire's eyes burned with exhaustion. She rose mechanically, made coffee she couldn't taste, and got Emma ready for school. Her daughter chattered about a science project, about a friend's upcoming birthday party, and Claire nodded at the right moments, murmured the appropriate responses, all while her mind remained fixed on the jewelry hidden 15 feet away. When Emma left for the bus, Claire stood at the window watching until the yellow vehicle disappeared around the corner. Then she went to her closet and pulled out the cloth bag. She unwrapped one of the necklaces, holding it up to the morning light. The emeralds caught the sun and threw green fire across the white walls of her bedroom. It was beautiful, breathtaking, and it terrified her. Gabriel had warned her to be careful, to use discretion, to understand that wealth like this attracted danger. She wrapped the necklace again and placed it back in the bag, then shoved it deeper into the closet beneath sweaters and old coats, as if burying it might make the problem disappear. It didn't. The weight of the discovery pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her phone rang. Jennifer. Claire stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. On the 5th ring, she gave in. Hello? Where have you been? Jennifer's voice was sharp, irritated. I've been trying to reach you for 2 days. I've been busy, work. Well, we need to talk about the house. The realtor came by yesterday. The repairs are going to cost more than we thought. The roof needs replacing, the foundation has cracks, and there's mold in the basement. We're looking at $50,000 just to make it sellable. Claire closed her eyes. Okay. So what does that mean? It means we're going to clear less than we expected. Maybe $40,000 each after everything's settled. I wanted to know if you found anything in that chest, anything we could sell to offset the costs. The lie came easily. Too easily. No, just quilts, old fabric, nothing valuable. Jennifer sighed. Figures. Michael thought maybe there were some antiques tucked away. But I told him Aunt Margaret never had anything worth a damn. She paused. You're still planning to take the quilts, right? Because if you don't want them, we can include them in the estate sale. No, Claire said quickly. I want them. Margaret left them to me. Fine, whatever. Just make sure you get them out of the house by next week. The realtor wants the place emptied so we can start repairs. I will. Jennifer hung up without saying goodbye. Claire set the phone down, her hands shaking. The conversation had been routine, ordinary, yet it felt like walking across a frozen lake, each word a potential crack in the ice. She'd lied to Jennifer's face, to her own sister, and she'd do it again. Because the moment she told the truth, the moment anyone knew about the jewelry, it would be taken from her. Split 4 ways, divided among people who'd never struggled the way she had, who'd never known what it felt like to choose between groceries and rent, who'd never lain awake at night, wondering how to keep a roof over their child's head. She spent the rest of the day researching Margaret. She started with the basics, pulling up public records, census data, obituaries. Margaret Ann Whitmore, born 1937, married Thomas Whitmore in 1960, widowed in 1981. No children. Worked as a seamstress at a local tailor shop until retiring in 1995. Lived on Maple Street for 43 years. The facts were sparse, unremarkable, revealing nothing about how a woman of modest means had come to possess a collection of jewels worth hundreds of millions. Claire searched for Thomas Whitmore next. The records were equally sparse. He'd been a factory worker, employed at the same plant for 20 years before his death. No indication of wealth or unusual circumstances. His obituary described him as a quiet man, well-liked by co-workers, survived by his wife Margaret. Nothing. She tried Margaret's parents, her siblings, anyone who might have left her an inheritance. The trail went cold. Margaret's mother had been a schoolteacher, her father a postal worker. No one in the family tree had money or connections to explain the jewelry. Frustrated, Claire turned to the jewelry itself. She pulled up the photographs she'd taken at Gabriel's office and studied them closely. Some of the pieces had markings, tiny stamps, or engravings on the metal. She zoomed in, squinting at the details. One of the rings bore a crest, barely visible, worn down by age. She took a screenshot and ran it through an image search. The results were vague, pointing to European nobility, possibly French or Belgian, late 1800s. Another piece, a brooch, had initials engraved on the back. E.V. She searched those initials alongside jewelry and 1890s and found nothing definitive, just hundreds of auction listings and historical records that led nowhere. By mid-afternoon, her eyes ached from staring at the screen. She made herself a sandwich she didn't eat and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the parking lot. The apartment complex was quiet, the few cars parked in their designated spots. the trees lining the sidewalk swaying gently in the breeze. It was ordinary. Safe. The kind of place where nothing remarkable ever happened. Yet inside her closet, hidden beneath sweaters, was a secret that could change everything. She thought about Gabriel's warning. People have been killed for far less. The words felt melodramatic, like something from a thriller, but she couldn't shake the unease they'd planted in her chest. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Claire returned to the chest. She pulled out the quilts one by one, laying them across the living room floor, and examined each seam, each stitch, searching for anything she might have missed. Margaret's note had said the chest held stories that couldn't be spoken aloud. What stories? Claire ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling the texture, the weight of the thread. One of the quilts, a patchwork of deep blues and silvers, had a section that felt different, thicker. She turned it over and noticed the stitching was uneven in one corner, as if repaired hastily. She found a small pair of scissors and carefully snipped the threads. Inside, folded into a tiny square, was a piece of paper. Her heart raced as she unfolded it. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting that wasn't Margaret's. The script was elegant, slanted, written in faded ink. It was a letter, dated April 1943. Claire's breath caught as she began to read. My dearest Margaret, I write this knowing I may not see you again. The war has taken so much from us, and what remains must be protected. The collection I've entrusted to you is not merely wealth. It is our family's legacy, saved from those who would destroy it. Keep it hidden. Tell no one. When the time comes, you will know what to do. With all my love, Elise. Claire read the letter 3 times, her mind racing. Elise. T.V. The initials on the brooch. This woman, whoever she was, had given the jewelry to Margaret during World War II. The collection wasn't Margaret's. It had been entrusted to her, hidden, protected from someone or something. Claire's hands trembled as she folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. This changed everything. The jewelry wasn't just valuable. It was part of a story, a history that stretched back decades. And Margaret had kept the secret her entire life. The next morning, Claire called in sick to work again. Her manager's voice was clipped, warning her that she was using up her limited sick days, but Claire barely heard him. She had to find out more about Elise. She drove to the local library, a small brick building tucked between a coffee shop and a law office, and approached the reference desk. The librarian, like an older woman with glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, looked up with a polite smile. I'm trying to research someone from the 1940s, Claire said. A woman named Elise. She might have been connected to my family, but I don't know her last name. She signed a letter with the initials E.V. The librarian's smile widened. That's a bit of a challenge, but we can try. Do you have any other information? A location? A specific date? The letter was dated April 1943, and it mentioned the war, so I'm assuming she was involved somehow. Maybe as a refugee or someone fleeing Europe. That narrows it down a bit. Let me see what I can find. She led Claire to a row of computers and pulled up a database of historical records. They searched for variations of the name Elise, filtered by the year 1943 and connections to the United States. The results were overwhelming. Hundreds of women with similar names, most of them unrelated. But then the librarian paused, her finger hovering over one entry. Here's something. Elise Vandermeer, Belgian national, arrived in the United States in 1942. She was part of a group of refugees fleeing the Nazi occupation. Claire leaned closer, her pulse quickening. Vandermeer. That could be E.V. It could? The librarian clicked on the entry, pulling up more details. It says she settled in New York briefly, then moved to the Midwest. No further records after 1945. It's possible she changed her name or returned to Europe after the war. Claire wrote down the information, her hand shaking. Is there anything else? Any mention of family or what she did before the war? The librarian scrolled through the records. Nothing specific. But if she was a refugee, there might be records with immigration services or historical societies that focus on World War II displaced persons. You could try contacting them. Claire thanked her and left the library, her mind spinning. Elise Vandermeer, a Belgian refugee who'd fled the Nazis and entrusted a fortune in jewelry to Margaret. It made sense. Families fleeing Europe had often smuggled their valuables out, hiding jewelry in coat linings, suitcases, anything that wouldn't draw attention. If Elise had given the collection to Margaret, it meant she'd trusted her completely. It also meant the jewelry had a provenance, a history that could be traced. And if it could be traced, it could be verified. It could be sold legitimately. But it also meant questions. If the jewelry had been hidden during the war, there might be claims on it. Other family members of Elise's who'd survived, governments seeking restitution for stolen art and valuables, organizations dedicated to returning looted property. Claire felt the weight of those possibilities pressing down on her. This wasn't just her secret anymore. It was part of something much larger, something tangled in history and loss. Over the next several days, Claire became obsessed. She contacted historical societies, searched through archives, and scoured online databases for any mention of Elise Vandermeer. Most of her inquiries went unanswered or led to dead ends. But then, on the 5th day, she received an email from a researcher at a Holocaust memorial organization. The message was brief but illuminating. Elise Vandermeer had been part of a wealthy Belgian family, prominent jewelers in Brussels before the war. When the Nazis invaded, the family had fled, smuggling what they could. Elise had made it to the United States, but most of her relatives had perished in concentration camps. The jewelry collection had likely been part of the family's business inventory, pieces they'd saved from being looted. Claire read the email 3 times, her chest tight. The jewelry wasn't just valuable. It was a remnant of a family destroyed by war. It was survival, desperation, and hope all compressed into stones and metal. And Margaret had kept it safe for more than 70 years, never selling it, never speaking of it, waiting for the right moment to pass it on. That moment had come. Margaret had chosen Claire, not because she was the favorite, but because she'd trusted her to understand, to carry the weight of the secret, to know what to do. But what was she supposed to do? The question haunted her as she sat at her kitchen table, the email glowing on her laptop screen. She could sell the collection. Gabriel had made it clear the value was legitimate, the pieces museum quality. She could auction them, use the money to change her life, to give Emma everything she deserved. But selling them meant exposure. It meant lawyers, contracts, publicity. It meant her family would find out, the world would find out, and the questions would never stop. Or she could keep the secret, hide the jewelry as Margaret had, wait for the right time, the right moment. But that felt like cowardice, like wasting the gift Margaret had given her. The answer came to her slowly, piecing itself together over days of restless thought. She would sell the collection, but carefully, discreetly. She'd work with Gabriel, use his connections, and ensure the sale was handled legally and ethically. She'd set aside enough to pay off her debts, secure a future for Emma, and donate the rest to organizations that helped refugees and Holocaust survivors. It felt right. It honored Elise's sacrifice, Margaret's trust, and her own need to move forward. But before she could act, the situation spiraled. It started with Michael. He called on a Tuesday evening, his voice casual, almost friendly. "Hey Claire, how's it going?" She tensed immediately. Michael never called to chat. "Fine. What do you need?" "Nothing. Just checking in. I was thinking about that chest you took. You know, the one with the quilts. Jennifer mentioned you were pretty insistent about keeping it." "Margaret left it to me." I know. I'm not saying you shouldn't have it. I'm just curious. I mean, it's a big piece of furniture. Must have been a pain to haul out of the attic. Makes me wonder if there was something else in there. Something valuable." Claire's pulse quickened. "There wasn't. Just quilts." "Right. Quilts." He paused, and she could hear the skepticism in his voice. "It's just that I was talking to Paul, and he mentioned he saw you leaving the house with a bag, a small cloth bag. He thought it was weird because you already had the chest." Her stomach dropped. Paul had seen her. She forced herself to stay calm. "I took some personal items, photos, letters, things that reminded me of Margaret." Photos and letters. Michael's tone shifted, harder now. "You sure that's all?" "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm just saying, if there was something valuable in that chest, something that should have been part of the estate, you'd tell us. Right?" The accusation hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Claire's hands clenched around the phone. "There's nothing, Michael. If you don't believe me, you can come search the chest yourself." "Maybe I will." He hung up. Claire sat frozen, her heart pounding. Michael suspected something. Worse, he was talking to Paul, comparing notes. If they started digging, started asking questions, it was only a matter of time before they discovered the truth. She thought about the jewelry hidden in her closet, about Gabriel's warning, and about the letter from Elise tucked in her pocket. Everything felt suddenly fragile, as if one wrong move would shatter the careful balance she'd been maintaining. That night, she moved the jewelry. She couldn't risk keeping it in the apartment, not with Michael's suspicion growing. She wrapped each piece carefully and placed them in a small lockbox she'd bought that afternoon. Then she drove to a storage facility on the edge of town, rented a unit under a fake name, and locked the box inside. It wasn't perfect, but it was safer than leaving it where Michael or Jennifer could find it if they decided to visit unannounced. The next day, Michael showed up at her apartment. She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. "I was in the neighborhood. I thought I'd stop by." Claire didn't move aside. "What do you want?" "Just to see the chest. You said I could." She hesitated, then stepped back, letting him in. The chest sat in the living room, exactly where she'd left it. Michael walked over to it, running his hand along the wood, then lifted the lid. Inside were the quilts, folded neatly. He pulled one out, shook it open, and examined it. Then another. And another. Claire stood near the door, her arms crossed, watching him with forced calm. He found nothing. After 10 minutes, he closed the lid and straightened up, his jaw tight. "Satisfied?" Claire asked. "Where's the bag?" "What bag?" "The one Paul saw you carrying." "In my closet. It has old photos and letters. Do you want to see those too?" He stared at her, trying to read her face. She met his gaze without flinching, even as her heart hammered in her chest. Finally, he shook his head. "Forget it. I just wanted to make sure." "Make sure of what?" "That you weren't hiding something." He left without another word. Claire closed the door and leaned against it, her legs weak. The confrontation had been inevitable, but it had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Michael didn't trust her. Worse, he was actively looking for proof that she'd taken something valuable. She needed to move quickly. She needed to sell the jewelry before anyone else got suspicious. That evening, she called Gabriel. He answered on the second ring. "Ms. Harper, I was wondering when I'd hear from you." I need to move forward with the sale, she said, as soon as possible. I understand. Have you considered the legal implications? So a collection of this magnitude will require documentation, provenance verification, and likely tax filings. It's not a simple transaction. I know, but I don't have time to wait. My family is getting suspicious. If they find out, they'll contest everything. Gabriel was silent for a moment. Then, I can arrange a private auction. It will take a few weeks to organize, but it's the most discreet option. You'll need to provide some information about how you acquired the pieces, but I can help you navigate that. What kind of information? A letter from the estate lawyer confirming the chest and its contents were left to you. Any historical records you've found. The letter you mentioned from Elise. Anything that establishes the jewelry's provenance. Claire thought about the letter hidden in her pocket, and about the email from the Holocaust memorial researcher about Margaret's note. She had enough. Barely. I can do that. Good. I'll start making calls. In the meantime, keep the jewelry secure. And Ms. Harper? His voice lowered. Be very careful. If your family is already suspicious, they may try to take legal action. You'll need to be prepared for that. She hung up and sat in the darkness of her living room, staring at the chest. It looked so ordinary now, just a piece of furniture cluttered with quilts, but it had become the center of everything. Her past, her future, the secret that could save her or destroy her. Outside, the parking lot was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. She thought about Elise, about a woman fleeing war with nothing but a few jewels and the hope that someone would keep them safe. She thought about Margaret, stitching those jewels into a chest, hiding them for decades, trusting that someday the right person would find them. And she thought about herself, a single mother drowning in debt, who'd been handed a lifeline she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to hold. The days that followed were tense. Gabriel worked behind the scenes, contacting collectors and auction houses, building a discreet network of potential buyers. Claire provided the documentation, scanning the letter from Elise, forwarding the email from the researcher, and obtaining a signed affidavit from Walter Grimsby, confirming that the chest and its contents had been legally left to her. It felt surreal, assembling proof of something so extraordinary, while her ordinary life continued around her. She still worked her shifts at the grocery store, still helped Emma with homework, still worried about the eviction notice that had been temporarily delayed, but not dismissed. Jennifer called twice more, her tone edged with suspicion. Michael said you let him see the chest. I did, and there was nothing in it, just quilts. So why is he convinced you're hiding something? Because Michael always thinks the worst of people, Claire said, her voice sharper than she intended. He can't accept that Margaret left me something without there being some conspiracy. Jennifer didn't respond right away. Then, if you're lying, Claire, it's going to come out. And when it does, we'll make sure you lose everything. The line went dead. Claire stood in her kitchen, staring at the phone, her chest tight with anger and fear. They were circling, her siblings, like predators sensing weakness. She had to move faster. She called Gabriel that night. How much longer? The auction is scheduled for 3 weeks from now, he said. I've secured interest from several major buyers. The bidding will be competitive. 3 weeks is too long. It's the fastest I can arrange without compromising discretion. If we rush, word will spread, and your family will hear about it. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. Fine. 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks felt like an eternity. Claire moved through her days in a haze of anxiety, every phone call from her siblings a potential threat, every knock on the door a moment of panic. She stopped answering their calls and stopped replying to their texts. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with unspoken accusations. She knew they were talking about her, planning something, but she didn't know what. All she could do was wait. Emma noticed the change. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, her daughter looked up from her homework and asked, "Are you okay, Mom?" Claire forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." "You seem worried." "I'm always worried," Claire said, reaching across the table to squeeze Emma's hand. "But it's nothing you need to worry about." Emma didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. That night, after her daughter was asleep, Claire stood at the window, staring out at the parking lot. The storage facility was 15 minutes away, the lockbox hidden in a unit no one knew about. The auction was 12 days away. 12 days until everything changed. She thought about what she'd do with the money, how she'd pay off her debts, how she'd find a real home for Emma, how she'd finally stop running. But beneath the hope was a cold current of fear, because she knew her family wouldn't let this go. Michael and Jennifer wouldn't accept that she'd been given something they hadn't. They'd fight her, and when they found out the truth, the battle would be brutal. The auction took place in a private gallery in the city, the kind of place where the wealthy moved silently through rooms filled with art and history. Gabriel had arranged everything, ensuring the event was invitation only, the guest list carefully vetted. Claire arrived early, her hands trembling as she signed the final paperwork. The jewelry had been transported under armed guard, each piece catalogued and displayed in locked cases. She walked through the gallery, staring at the collection under the soft lighting, and felt a strange sense of disconnection. These pieces, these stones that had been hidden for so long, were about to be sold to strangers. It felt like betrayal and relief all at once. The bidding started at 8 o'clock. Claire sat in the back of the room, watching as buyers examined the pieces, their faces impassive, their bids delivered with subtle gestures. The numbers climbed quickly, each increment larger than she'd imagined. A ruby necklace sold for $18 million, a diamond bracelet for $22. The emerald pieces drew fierce competition, the bids escalating until one collector finally won at $34 million. See, by the time the auction ended, the total exceeded Gabriel's initial estimate. $247 million. After fees and taxes, Claire would receive just over $200 million. She sat in stunned silence as the room emptied, the buyers departing with their acquisitions, the staff dismantling the displays. Gabriel approached her, his expression carefully neutral. "Congratulations, Ms. Harper. You're a very wealthy woman." The words didn't feel real. Claire nodded numbly. "What happens now?" "The funds will be transferred to an account we've set up for you. It will take a few days to process. I'd recommend consulting with a financial advisor and a lawyer immediately. You'll need guidance on managing this kind of wealth." She thanked him and left, stepping out into the cool night air. The city was alive around her, lights glittering, cars rushing past, people moving through their ordinary lives, unaware that her entire world had just shifted. She drove home slowly, her mind blank, her hand steady on the wheel. When she reached her apartment, Emma was asleep, the neighbor watching over her. Claire paid the woman and thanked her, then locked the door and stood in the silence of her living room. The chest still sat against the wall, empty now, its purpose fulfilled. She ran her hand over the wood, feeling the scratches and dents, and thought about Margaret, about the trust she'd placed in her, about the stories hidden in fabric and jewels. The money arrived 4 days later. Claire stared at the balance on her laptop screen, the number so large it didn't fit properly in the display. $203 million. She sat back, her breath shallow, and tried to process what it meant. No more eviction notices, no more debt collectors, no more choosing between groceries and rent. Emma could go to any school she wanted. They could live anywhere, do anything. The possibilities stretched endlessly before her, dizzying and terrifying all at once. But first, There were things she had to do. She contacted a lawyer, a woman Gabriel had recommended, who specialized in estate law and wealth management. They met the next day, and Claire explained everything: the chest, the jewelry, the auction. The lawyer listened carefully, taking notes, her expression unreadable. When Claire finished, the woman leaned back in her chair. "Your family will find out," she said bluntly. "When they do, they'll likely contest the inheritance. They'll argue that the jewelry was part of the estate and should have been divided equally. You need to be prepared for a legal battle." "I have documentation," Claire said. "The chest and everything in it was left to me specifically." The estate lawyer confirmed it. "That will help, but your siblings can still file a lawsuit. It will be expensive, time-consuming, and ugly. You'll need to decide if you're willing to fight." Claire met her gaze. "I am." The lawyer nodded. "Then let's get started." The lawsuit arrived 3 weeks after the auction. Claire had been expecting it, but seeing the official documents still sent a shock through her system. Michael, Jennifer, and Paul were jointly suing her for fraud, concealment of estate assets, and breach of fiduciary duty. They claimed the jewelry found in the chest should have been disclosed to the estate and divided equally among all heirs. They were demanding their share of the proceeds, plus damages for emotional distress and legal fees. The amount they sought was staggering: $185 million, roughly 3/4 of what she'd received. Claire sat at her kitchen table, the lawsuit spread before her, and felt a cold fury settle in her chest. They'd finally made their move. For weeks, she'd been waiting for this, knowing it was inevitable. And now that it had arrived, she felt almost relieved. The uncertainty was over. The battle was beginning. She called her lawyer, Catherine Morrison, who'd been preparing for this exact scenario. "They're claiming you intentionally hid the jewelry," Catherine said, with her voice calm and professional. "They're arguing that because the jewelry was inside the chest, which was part of the estate, it should have been declared and divided. It's a weak argument, but it will require a response. What do? We file a motion to dismiss. We have documentation proving the chest and all its contents were specifically bequeathed to you. Margaret's will was clear. The estate lawyer confirmed it. And we have the letter from Elise establishing the jewelry's provenance, which shows it was always intended to be kept separate from the general estate." "Will that be enough?" Catherine paused. "It should be, but these cases can be unpredictable. Your siblings have money for good lawyers, and they're motivated. We need to be prepared for a fight." Over the following months, Claire's life became consumed by legal proceedings, depositions, document requests, interrogatories. Her siblings' lawyers were relentless, demanding every detail of how she'd discovered the jewelry, when she'd had it appraised, why she hadn't immediately disclosed it to the family. Claire answered each question carefully, guided by Catherine, never wavering from the truth. She'd found the jewelry hidden in the lining of a chest that Margaret had left specifically to her. She'd had it appraised to determine its value and provenance. She'd sold it at auction because it was hers to sell. The worst part was the depositions themselves. Sitting across from Michael, Jennifer, and Paul in sterile conference rooms, their lawyers firing questions designed to make her look greedy, dishonest, manipulative. Michael's face was hard, his eyes cold, as if she were a stranger rather than his sister. Jennifer's questions dripped with contempt, each one laced with the implication that Claire had stolen from them. Paul barely looked at her, his jaw tight, his answers to his own lawyer's questions brief and clipped. During one particularly brutal session, Jennifer's lawyer leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Ms. Harper, you expect us to believe that your aunt, a woman who lived on a modest pension, somehow possessed jewelry worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and you just happened to be the only one who knew about it?" Claire met his gaze steadily. I didn't know about it until I found it. Margaret hid it intentionally. She left it to me because she trusted me to understand its significance." "Convenient," the lawyer said. "And you didn't think to inform your siblings? To share this discovery with the people who were equally entitled to Margaret's estate?" "The chest and its contents were left to me," Claire said, her voice firm. "Not to the estate. To me specifically. I had no legal obligation to disclose it." "But you had a moral obligation," Catherine cut in sharply. "That's not a legal question, counsel. Move on." The deposition ended with nothing resolved, only more animosity thickening the air. When Claire left the building, she felt hollowed out, exhausted by the constant attacks on her character. She sat in her car for a long time before driving home, staring at the city skyline, and wondering if this was what wealth was supposed to feel like. Empty. Isolating. A prize that came with a cost she hadn't anticipated. But through it all, she held on to one thought. She was right. Margaret had chosen her. The jewelry was hers, and she wasn't going to let her siblings take it from her, not through intimidation or legal maneuvering. She'd fight for as long as it took. The case went to court 6 months after the lawsuit was filed. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, with high ceilings and rows of benches that echoed when anyone moved. Claire sat beside Catherine at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight. Across the aisle, Michael, Jennifer, and Paul sat with their legal team, their expressions grim. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled into a tight bun, reviewed the documents in front of her with methodical precision. The trial lasted 3 days. Michael's lawyer presented their case first, on arguing that the jewelry had been concealed as part of a deliberate scheme to defraud the estate. He called witnesses, the estate lawyer, who testified about the inventory of Margaret's belongings, a forensic accountant, who detailed Claire's financial difficulties prior to the discovery, even a neighbor of Margaret's, who claimed the old woman had once mentioned valuable family heirlooms. Each testimony was designed to paint Claire as desperate and opportunistic, someone who'd taken advantage of a dying woman's trust. But Catherine was prepared. She systematically dismantled their arguments. The estate lawyer confirmed under cross-examination that the chest had been specifically bequeathed to Claire, not included in the general estate. The forensic accountant admitted that there was no evidence Claire had known about the jewelry before Margaret's death, and the neighbor's testimony was revealed to be vague and unreliable, based on a conversation from years ago that could have referred to anything. Then Catherine presented their case. She introduced the letter from Elise Vandermeer, the one sewn into the quilt, and had a historian testify about its authenticity and significance. She showed the documentation from the Holocaust Memorial Organization, establishing the jewelry's provenance and explaining why it had been hidden. And she called Gabriel Roth, who testified about the appraisal, confirming that the collection was legitimate and that Claire had acted entirely within the law when selling it. And the most powerful moment came when Catherine read Margaret's note aloud in court. "This chest has been in our family for generations. It holds more than fabric. It holds the stories we could not speak aloud. I trust you will understand." The words hung in the silent courtroom, and Claire saw something shift in the judge's expression. A flicker of understanding, of recognition. When it was Claire's turn to testify, she spoke clearly and without hesitation. She described finding the jewelry, the shock of the discovery, the research she'd done to understand its origins. She explained why she hadn't told her siblings, not out of greed, but because she knew they wouldn't understand, wouldn't respect what Margaret had entrusted to her. She talked about Elise Vandermeer, about a family destroyed by war, about Margaret's decades-long vigil protecting something precious. And she looked directly at Michael, Jennifer, and Paul as she spoke, her voice steady. "Margaret didn't leave this to me because she thought I deserved it more than you," Claire said. She left it to me because she knew I would honor the responsibility. She knew I would protect it, understand it, and use it in a way that mattered. And that's exactly what I've done." The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even Michael looked away, his jaw tight. The judge called a brief recess, and when she returned, her decision was clear. She ruled in Claire's favor. The jewelry had been part of a specific bequest, not the general estate. Claire had acted legally and ethically. The lawsuit was dismissed, and Michael, Jennifer, and Paul were ordered to pay Claire's legal fees. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. Claire closed her eyes, feeling a wave of relief so intense it made her dizzy. Catherine squeezed her hand. "It's over," she said quietly. "You won." But winning didn't feel the way Claire had imagined. As she walked out of the courtroom, Michael, Jennifer, and Paul were already gone, their lawyers packing up quickly, avoiding eye contact. She'd expected some kind of confrontation, some final exchange of words. But there was nothing. Just silence and the hollow echo of her footsteps in the empty hallway. She realized then that the victory was also a loss. Whatever fragile connection had existed between her and her siblings was gone, severed by greed and suspicion. They would never forgive her, and she wasn't sure she cared anymore. Outside the courthouse, for reporters had gathered, alerted by the unusual nature of the case. They shouted questions as Claire emerged. "Miss Harper, how does it feel to win? What will you do with the money? Do you have any comment for your family?" She ignored them all, walking quickly to her car, Catherine shielding her from the cameras. The questions followed her, relentless, until she was inside the vehicle with the doors locked and the engine running. She drove away without looking back. That evening, Claire sat in her apartment, the quiet pressing around her. Emma was at a friend's house, and the space felt too empty, too still. She thought about the trial, about the judge's words, about the look on Michael's face when the ruling was announced. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt tired. The lawsuit had taken 6 months of her life, draining her emotionally and mentally. The money was still there, safe in accounts Catherine had helped her set up, but it no longer felt like freedom. It felt like a weight. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations, you got what you wanted. I hope it was worth losing your family." It wasn't signed, but she knew it was from Jennifer. Claire stared at the message, then deleted it without responding. There was nothing to say. Jennifer would never understand. None of them would. But then, slowly, things began to change. Claire started to see the money not as a prize or a burden, but as a tool, a way to create something meaningful. She thought about Elise Vandermeer, about a woman who'd lost everything and still managed to save something precious. She thought about Margaret, who'd spent her entire life protecting that legacy. And she thought about what they would want her to do. The first thing she did was pay off every debt. The eviction notice disappeared. The collectors stopped calling. She bought a house, not a mansion, but a modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood with good schools. It had a yard for Emma, a garden she could tend, and enough space to breathe. Emma cried when she saw it, happy tears that made Claire's chest ache. "Is this really ours?" her daughter asked, standing in the empty living room, her voice echoing off the walls. Claire nodded, unable to speak. Next, she established a foundation. She called it the Vandermeer Whitmore Legacy Fund, dedicated to helping refugees and supporting Holocaust education. She donated $50 million to start, so working with organizations that provided legal aid, housing, and resettlement services to displaced families. It felt right. It felt like honoring the story behind the jewelry, the lives that had been destroyed, and the resilience that had survived. She also quietly paid off the medical debts of several families in her old neighborhood, people she'd known who were drowning the way she had been. She did it anonymously, not wanting recognition, just wanting to ease the burden for others, the way Margaret had eased hers. Each time she signed a check, she thought about the chest, about quilts folded over secrets, about trust passed from one generation to the next. Months passed. The media attention faded. The reporters moved on to other stories. Claire's life settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by struggle, but by possibility. From Emma thrived in her new school, making friends, joining clubs, her confidence growing in ways that made Claire's heart swell. They had dinners together every night, real dinners, with conversations and laughter. Not hurried meals eaten in silence while Claire worried about bills. They took a vacation, their first ever, to the ocean. And Claire watched her daughter run along the beach, her hair whipping in the wind, her face bright with joy. One afternoon, nearly a year after the trial, Claire was working in her garden when a car pulled into the driveway. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and saw Walter Grimsby, the estate lawyer, stepping out. He looked older than she remembered, his movement slower, but his expression was kind. Claire stood, brushing dirt from her hands, and walked over to greet him. "Mr. Grimsby, this is a surprise. I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I wanted to see how you were doing. I heard about the trial. I'm glad it turned out the way it did." Claire smiled. "Thank you. Would you like to come inside?" They sat in her living room, and Walter accepted a glass of iced tea. For a while, they made small talk, discussing the house, Emma's schooling, the changes in Claire's life. Then Walter set down his glass and looked at her seriously. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I couldn't say before. Margaret made me promise not to, but now that she's gone and the trial is over, I think you deserve to know." Claire's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "Margaret knew exactly what was in that chest," Walter said. "She knew about the jewelry, the value, all of it. She'd had it appraised years ago, though she never sold a single piece. She wanted to leave it to you specifically because she saw something in you. She told me once that you reminded her of herself, that you understood loss and resilience in a way your siblings never had." Claire felt tears prick her eyes. "She never said anything. She didn't want to burden you with the knowledge while she was alive. She was afraid it would change how you saw her, or how you saw yourself. But she wanted you to have it because she believed you'd use it wisely. And from what I can see, she was right." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "She also left this for you. I was instructed to give it to you only after the estate was settled and you'd made your decisions about the jewelry. I think enough time has passed." Claire took the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside was another letter, written in Margaret's shaky handwriting. She unfolded it carefully and began to read. "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then you've found the jewelry, and you've made your choice about what to do with it. I hope it brought you the freedom you deserved, the freedom I never had. When Elise gave me those jewels, she told me they were meant to survive, to be passed on when the time was right. I kept them hidden my whole life, waiting for someone who would understand their weight and their worth. That person was you. I know your siblings will be angry. I know they'll fight you. But don't let their greed take from you what you've earned through hardship and grace. Use this gift to build a life that matters. Use it to help others the way you once needed help. And know that I am proud of you, more than I ever had the chance to say. With all my love, Aunt Margaret." Claire's tears fell freely now, blurring the words. She folded the letter and held it against her chest, feeling the finality of Margaret's love and trust. Walter stayed for a while longer, sharing stories about Margaret, about the woman she'd been before age, and solitude had worn her down. When he finally left, Claire sat alone in the quiet of her home and felt, for the first time in her life, truly at peace. The years that followed were not perfect. There were challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But they were hers, lived on her own terms, without the constant pressure of survival. Emma graduated high school with honors and went on to college, her tuition paid in full, her future bright. Claire traveled, saw places she'd only dreamed of, and met people whose stories reminded her of Elise and Margaret. She expanded the foundation, creating scholarships for children of refugees, funding research into Holocaust history, and supporting artists who told stories of displacement and resilience. And sometimes, late at night, Claire would go to the chest, which still sat in her living room, and run her hands over the wood. The quilts were still inside, folded neatly, though the hidden pockets were empty now. She'd kept one piece of jewelry, a simple brooch with a small ruby, the first one she'd found. It sat in a drawer upstairs, a reminder of where she'd come from and what she'd been given. She wore it once a year, on the anniversary of Margaret's death, and thought about the women who'd carried this legacy before her. One spring afternoon, 5 years after the trial, Claire received a letter. It was from Michael. She almost didn't open it, but curiosity won out. Inside was a brief note, his handwriting neat and controlled. Claire, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to even respond. But I wanted you to know that I was wrong. Not about the money, though I was wrong about that too. I was wrong about you. I let jealousy and greed blind me to what kind of person you are. Margaret saw it. I didn't. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I hope you're doing well. Michael. Claire read the letter twice, then set it aside. She didn't respond. Not because she was angry, but because there was nothing left to say. The apology was years too late, and the damage was done. But she didn't throw the letter away. She kept it, tucked into the chest alongside Margaret's notes and Elise's letter, another piece of the story that had shaped her life. Jennifer never reached out. Neither did Paul. Claire heard through distant relatives that Jennifer had remarried, moved to another state, and rarely spoke of the family. Paul had started a business, failed, and started another. Their lives moved on parallel tracks, never intersecting with hers. She felt no bitterness about it, only a quiet acceptance that some relationships were meant to end, that some fractures couldn't be mended. Emma grew into a young woman who was kind, curious, and fiercely independent. She asked about the jewelry once, when she was in college, and Claire told her everything. The discovery, the auction, the trial, the legacy of Elise and Margaret. Emma listened quietly, then hugged her mother tightly. "Thank you for fighting for us," she said. Oh, and Claire realized that was all that mattered. Not the money, not the vindication, but the life she'd built for her daughter, the future she'd secured through courage and determination. On the 10th anniversary of Margaret's death, Claire organized a small memorial. She invited Walter Grimsby, Gabriel Roth, Catherine Morrison, and a few others who'd been part of the journey. They gathered in her garden, beneath the shade of an oak tree she'd planted the year she bought the house. Claire stood before them and spoke about Margaret, about her quiet strength, her hidden generosity, her trust in the face of uncertainty. She spoke about Elise, about a family destroyed by hatred and a woman who'd saved what she could. And she spoke about what the jewelry had meant, not just the wealth, but the responsibility, the story, the legacy. "Margaret once told me that every stitch tells a story," Claire said, her voice steady. She spent her life stitching together a story of survival, of hope, of trust passed from one woman to another. That story didn't end with her. It continues through the foundation, through the lives we've helped, through the memory we keep alive. And it continues through me, and through Emma, and through anyone who hears this story and understands that wealth without purpose is meaningless. She raised a glass, and the others joined her. To Margaret, to Elise, to the women who came before us and the ones who will come after. May we honor their courage by living with intention and grace. They drank, and in the quiet that followed, Claire felt the weight of the past finally lift. She was no longer the struggling single mother drowning in debt. She was no longer the woman mocked for taking a worthless chest. She was someone who'd been trusted with a legacy and had honored it. Someone who'd fought for what was hers and used it to create something good. Someone who'd turned a hidden fortune into a force for change. As the sun set over her garden, casting long shadows across the grass, Claire thought about the journey that had brought her here. The abandoned chest in a dusty attic, the glint of jewels hidden beneath fabric, the courtroom battles and sleepless nights. The moment she'd realized that wealth wasn't just about money, but about what you did with it, how you carried it, who you helped along the way. Margaret had known that. Elise had known that. And now, finally, Claire knew it too. She looked at Emma, standing near the oak tree, laughing at something Walter had said, and felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it took her breath away. This was what Margaret had given her. Not just money, but the chance to be the mother, the person she'd always wanted to be, the chance to live without fear, the chance to give back, the chance to matter. The guests eventually left, their cars pulling away into the dusk. Claire stood alone in her garden, the chest story finally complete, the legacy secured. She thought about the quilt tucked away in the chest, the one with the hidden letter, and realized that her own life had become a kind of quilt, stitched together from moments of struggle and grace, loss and discovery, fear and courage. Every stitch told a story. And hers was one of transformation, of a woman who'd been given a secret and turned it into a life worth living. She went inside, locked the door, and climbed the stairs to her daughter's old room, which she'd converted into a study. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Margaret, taken decades ago, her face young and unlined, her eyes bright with something Claire now recognized as hope. Beside it was a photograph of Elise, one she'd found in a historical archive, a woman in her 30s, standing beside a jewelry counter in Brussels, her expression serious but kind. And beside that, a photograph of herself and Emma, taken the day they'd moved into this house, both of them smiling, both of them free. 3 women, separated by time and circumstance, connected by a chest, a collection of jewels, and a story that refused to be forgotten. Claire touched the frame gently, then turned off the light and went to bed. Tomorrow, the foundation would break ground on a new refugee center. On tomorrow, she'd meet with donors and plan the next phase of their work. Tomorrow, life would continue, busy and purposeful and filled with meaning. But tonight, she slept soundly, dreamlessly, knowing that she'd honored the trust placed in her, knowing that the chest, empty now of its hidden treasure, had given her something far more valuable than jewels. It had given her a chance to rewrite her story, and she'd taken it. The night after Claire first discovered the jewelry, she couldn't bring herself to leave the apartment. She'd called Emma's friend's mother and asked if her daughter could spend the night, claiming a migraine, though the truth was far more complicated. She needed time alone with the discovery, time to process what it meant without having to maintain the facade of normalcy. After the call, she sat on her bedroom floor, so the cloth bag in front of her, and one by one, she took out each piece again, studying them in the lamplight. There was a necklace with 3 strands of perfectly matched pearls, each one luminous and flawless. The clasp, decorated with tiny diamonds, arranged in a flower pattern. Claire held it up, watching how the pearls caught the light, and wondered who had worn it last. Had it been Elise, Attending some grand event in Brussels before the world collapsed? Or had it belonged to Elise's mother or grandmother, passed down through generations until war made keeping it more dangerous than losing it? She found a pair of earrings, emerald drops surrounded by smaller diamonds, their settings so intricate they looked like lace made of metal. They were heavy in her palm, substantial in a way that spoke of wealth beyond anything she'd known. She tried to imagine the craftsman who'd made them, bending over his workbench with magnifying lenses and tiny tools, creating something meant to last centuries. And it had. It had survived war, survived exile, survived 7 decades hidden in a chest, waiting for this moment. Each piece had its own character. A brooch shaped like a butterfly, its wings studded with sapphires that graduated from pale blue to deep navy. A bracelet so delicate it seemed impossible it hadn't broken, its links thin as thread but strong enough to hold a dozen rubies in place. A ring with a stone so large Claire couldn't imagine wearing it. A diamond that must have been 10 carats at least, cut in an old style that made it throw rainbows across her bedroom wall. She spread them all out on her bed, arranging them by type, then by color, then by size, trying to make sense of the collection. There were 43 pieces total. Some were clearly sets, designed to be worn together. Others were standalone statement pieces. A few seemed almost modest by comparison, simple gold chains or small gem studs, but even these were of exceptional quality, their simplicity a kind of elegance that cheap jewelry could never achieve. As she handled each piece, Claire found herself thinking about value in a way she never had before. These objects were worth millions individually, hundreds of millions collectively, yet their monetary value seemed almost beside the point. They were beautiful, yes, but they were also evidence of lives lived, of choices made, of a family's attempt to save something precious when everything else was being destroyed. They were Elise's defiance against obliteration, Margaret's faithfulness across decades, and now they were Claire's responsibility to understand and honor. She stayed up until 4 a.m, unable to sleep, unable to stop touching the jewelry, as if handling it might help her absorb its history through her fingertips. By the time exhaustion finally overcame her, she'd made a decision. She would learn everything she could about these pieces, about Elise, about how they'd come to be hidden in her aunt's chest. She owed that much to the women who'd protected them. The research consumed her in the weeks that followed. After her initial visit to the local library, Claire became a regular presence in the archives section, spending hours scrolling through microfilm and digitized records. She learned about the Nazi occupation of Belgium, about how Jewish families and anyone with wealth had been systematically targeted, their property seized, their businesses destroyed. She read testimonies from survivors, accounts of people who'd sewn jewelry into coat linings, hidden valuables in false-bottomed suitcases, or buried family treasures in gardens they'd never see again. She found a researcher at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, who specialized in looted art and valuables. His name was Dr. Eli Cohen, and he responded to her initial email within hours. Over the next several weeks, they corresponded regularly. Claire sent him photographs of the jewelry, detailed descriptions of each piece, and copies of Elise's letter. Dr. Cohen was patient and thorough, guiding her through the process of establishing provenance. The Vandermeer family were well-known jewelers in Brussels, he wrote in one email. They had a shop on Rue de Pierres that was considered one of the finest in the city. When the Germans invaded in 1940, the family tried to flee. Most were caught and sent to camps. Elise was one of the few who made it out. The fact that she managed to save any of the family's inventory is remarkable. He sent her photographs from before the war, images of the Vandermeer shop, its windows glittering with displays, and a family portrait showing Elise as a young woman, perhaps 25, standing with her parents and 2 siblings. All of them were formally dressed, their expressions serious in the way of old photographs, and Claire stared at Elise's face for a long time, and trying to see in it the woman who would one day flee across an ocean with a fortune sewn into her belongings. "The pieces you've shown me match the style and quality of Vandermeer work," Dr. Cohen continued in another email. "If these are indeed from their collection, they would have extraordinary historical and cultural value beyond their monetary worth. I would recommend having them examined by a specialist in Art Deco and pre-war European jewelry. I can provide some names if you'd like." Claire took him up on the offer. One of the names he provided was a curator at a major museum in New York who specialized in jewelry from this exact period. The curator, a woman named Dr. Helena Strauss, agreed to examine photographs of the collection and, after seeing them, insisted on viewing the pieces in person. Claire arranged to meet her in the city, bringing 3 of the most elaborate pieces in a locked case that Gabriel had lent her. Dr. Strauss's office was in a museum building that smelled of old wood and preservation chemicals. The curator herself was in her 60s, elegant and precise, with silver hair pulled back in a chignon and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She handled the jewelry with white cotton gloves, examining each piece under bright lights and through various magnifying devices, occasionally making soft sounds of appreciation or surprise. "This is extraordinary," she said finally, setting down a sapphire necklace. "The craftsmanship is museum quality. These stones, the settings, the design work, all of it is consistent with high-end Belgian jewelry from the 1920s and 30s. And look here," she pointed to a tiny mark on the back of a brooch. "This is the Vandermeer maker's mark. I've only seen it a few times before, always on pieces that ended up in private collections or museums. So they're authentic, without question. These pieces are part of jewelry history. If you're considering selling them, any major auction house would be thrilled to handle the sale." "But," she paused, meeting Claire's eyes, "you should also consider that pieces like these belong in museums, where people can study them, where their history can be preserved and shared." Claire thought about that conversation for weeks afterward. Part of her was drawn to the idea of donating the collection, of ensuring it would be preserved and displayed. But she also thought about Emma, about the eviction notice, about the life she could build with the money from a sale. In the end, she decided she could do both. She would sell most of the collection, but keep a few pieces to donate later, once the foundation was established, and she had the infrastructure to ensure they'd be displayed with the full context of their history. The actual auction day was unlike anything Claire had experienced. She arrived at the gallery 2 hours early, unable to stay away, and watched as the staff made final preparations. Each piece of jewelry was displayed in its own locked case, with perfect lighting, designed to make the stones come alive. Small placards explained the provenance, the Vandermeer connection, the journey from Brussels to America. Claire read them all, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. These objects that had been hidden for so long were now on display for wealthy strangers to examine and acquire. Gabriel found her standing in front of the sapphire butterfly brooch. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Part of me wants to grab everything and run. Part of me feels like I'm betraying Margaret and Elise by selling these. And part of me is just terrified that no one will bid, that I've made a terrible mistake." He smiled gently. "I can assure you that last concern is unfounded. We've had intense interest from collectors around the world. Some of these pieces will likely set records for their category." He paused. "As for the other concerns, I think you should remember what you plan to do with the proceeds. You're not selling these for greed. You're using them to create something meaningful. I think Elise and Margaret would approve." The auction began at 8, Claire sat in the back row, her hands clenched in her lap, as the auctioneer opened with a brief history of the collection. Then the bidding started. The first piece was a relatively simple diamond bracelet, estimated at $2 million. The opening bid was $3 million. Claire's breath caught. From there, the numbers escalated rapidly. 4 million. 5. 7. 10. The final hammer fell at 11.2 million, and the room erupted in polite applause. The sapphire butterfly went for 23 million, fought over by two bidders who drove the price up in increments of $500,000 until one finally conceded. The emerald earrings Claire had admired that first night fetched 31 million. A ruby ring set a record for that type of stone, and selling for 42 million to a collector on the phone who never appeared in person. Claire watched it all in a daze, the numbers becoming abstract, meaningless beyond their confirmation that Gabriel had been right about the collection's value. When the auction finally ended, 3 hours after it began, the total exceeded even the most optimistic projections. $247 million. After fees and taxes, she'd received just over 200 million. The number was so large she couldn't process it. It was more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. In the days after the auction, before the money actually arrived in her accounts, Claire experienced a strange limbo. She still went to work, still lived in her cramped apartment, and still worried about ordinary things like Emma's science project and whether the car would make it through another winter. But beneath it all was the knowledge that everything was about to change, that she was standing on the edge of a transformation so complete it frightened her. She couldn't tell Emma yet, couldn't tell anyone. She moved through her days feeling like an imposter, smiling at coworkers who complained about bills, nodding along with other parents at school events who worried about college tuition, all while knowing that she would never have to worry about money again. The disconnect was disorienting. When the money finally arrived, Claire stared at the balance on her laptop for 30 minutes straight, refreshing the page repeatedly to make sure it was real. 203 million for $714,612. The precision of the number somehow made it more real than a round figure would have. She closed the laptop, walked to the window, and looked out at the parking lot of her apartment complex. Nothing had changed. The same cars in the same spots, the same trash can overflowing near the dumpster, the same stray cat sleeping on the hood of a rusted sedan. But everything had changed. The first withdrawal she made was for $847, the exact amount she owed on her credit card. She paid it online, watching the balance drop to zero, and felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't experienced in years. No more interest charges, no more late fees, no more anxiety every time she opened her mailbox. She paid off her car loan next, then her student loans, then the back rent she owed. One by one, she erased every debt, every obligation, every weight that had been pressing down on her for over a decade. The day she bought the house, she brought Emma with her to see it for the first time. Her daughter had been confused when Claire had told her they were going to look at a house, asking questions Claire deflected with vague answers about some money from Aunt Margaret's estate. Emma didn't push, but her eyes were curious, cautious, as if afraid to hope for too much. The house was in a neighborhood Claire had driven through countless times, admiring the tree-lined streets and well-kept yards, never imagining she could afford to live there. It was a 3-bedroom craftsman with a front porch, a fenced backyard, and a kitchen with actual counter space. Not a mansion by any measure, but to Claire, who'd spent years in cramped apartments and worried constantly about eviction, it was a palace. Emma walked through each room slowly, touching the walls as if to confirm they were solid. She opened closets, tested light switches, stood in the backyard, and looked up at the sky framed by oak trees. When she came back inside, her eyes were wet. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "How did you do this?" Claire knelt down to her daughter's level, taking both her hands. "Remember the chest Aunt Margaret left me? There was something hidden inside it, something very valuable. I sold it, and this is what it gave us. A new start, a real home." Emma threw her arms around her mother's neck, and they stood there in the empty living room of their new house, holding each other, both of them crying for everything they'd survived and everything that was finally possible. The foundation took months to establish properly. Claire worked with lawyers, accountants, and nonprofit specialists to create an organization that would last beyond her lifetime. She wanted it done right, wanted every dollar to go where it would make a difference. The Vandermeer Whitmore Legacy Fund officially launched on what would have been Margaret's 89th birthday. The first grant they gave was to a refugee resettlement organization in the city, funding legal services for asylum seekers. Claire met some of the families they helped, people who'd fled violence in Syria, Afghanistan, Central America. She saw her own desperation reflected in their faces, the same fear she'd felt when the eviction notice had arrived, the same exhaustion from fighting just to survive. But she also saw hope, the same fragile hope she'd carried, and she understood why Margaret and Elise had protected the jewelry for so long. It wasn't about the wealth, it was about the possibility of something better. One of the families they helped was a mother and 2 daughters from Somalia. The mother, Amira, had fled with her children after her husband was killed. She'd spent 3 years in a refugee camp before finally being approved for resettlement. When Claire met her at the organization's office, Amira's English was limited, but her gratitude was clear. She held Claire's hands and spoke in Somali, the translator conveying her words. "She says you have given her family a future," the translator said. "She says she will never forget your kindness." Claire felt tears sting her eyes. "Tell her I understand what it's like to be afraid for your child's future. Tell her I'm glad I could help." As Amira and her daughters left, Claire watched them walk down the street, the girls chattering excitedly about the apartment they'd been given, the school they'd attend. She thought about Elise, fleeing Belgium with jewels sewn into her clothes, desperate to save something from the destruction. She thought about Margaret, protecting those jewels for 7 decades, waiting for the right moment. And she thought about the chain of trust and hope that had led to this moment, to a Somali mother and her daughters getting a chance at safety. This was what the jewelry had been meant for, not to sit in a vault or hang on the necks of the wealthy, but to create possibilities, to offer hope, to help people survive when survival seemed impossible. Claire understood now why Margaret had chosen her, not because she deserved it more than her siblings, but because she knew what it meant to need help, to need hope, to need someone to believe in your future when you couldn't see it yourself. Years later, when Emma was in college studying international relations, she came home for Thanksgiving and asked her mother to tell her the whole story again. They sat in the living room of the house that the jewelry had bought, the chest still against the wall, and Claire told her daughter everything. About finding the jewels, about the terror and excitement of the discovery, about the auction and the trial, about establishing the foundation and the families they'd helped. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked. "Selling the collection, giving so much of it away?" Claire thought about the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "The jewelry was beautiful, but it was also a burden. It represented loss, survival, responsibility. By selling it and using the money the way we have, I feel like I freed it. I freed Elise and Margaret from having to protect it anymore. And I freed myself to live without fear." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'm proud of you, Mom, for everything you did, for fighting for us." Claire smiled, pulling her daughter close. I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. You're going to do amazing things with your life. You already are." As they sat together in the quiet comfort of their home, Claire felt the circle close. The jewelry had passed from Elise to Margaret to her, by each woman protecting it until the moment was right to let it go. She'd honored their trust, used it wisely, created something that would outlast them all. And now, watching Emma grow into a woman who cared about justice and helping others, Claire knew the legacy would continue, transformed from jewels and metal into something far more precious: compassion, purpose, and hope. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.